Gideon Sterling's hands were calloused and worn as he wiped down the faded counter of the Anchor Diner for the fourth time that evening. The dinner crowd, if you could call 3 fishermen and a retired schoolteacher a crowd, had thinned out, leaving behind the familiar smell of sea salt and black coffee that clung to every surface like memory. Outside, the Atlantic wind rattled the windows, carrying whispers of a storm rolling in from the coast. He glanced at the register, mentally calculating the slim stack of bills inside, his jaw tightening with every number. It wasn't enough. Not for the property tax notice folded in his back pocket, the one printed in bold red letters threatening seizure, or for Zelda's upcoming tuition at the community college. His daughter deserved better than this sinking ship. Just hold on a little longer, he thought, rubbing the back of his neck where exhaustion had settled like a permanent weight. He'd been repeating that same tired promise since his wife's passing 3 winters ago, when the world grew colder and the anchor became his only lifeline. Mystic used to breathe with tourists and laughter. Now, half the storefronts on Main Street sat hollow, their windows dark, their for lease signs faded by sun and neglect. The lobster plant closed first. Then the gift shops. Now Gideon's Diner held on like a man gripping the edge of a cliff, fingers slipping one by one. The bell above the door chimed, a bright, hopeful sound his late wife had picked out years ago, and Gideon turned, dish towel still in hand. The sight stopped him cold. A young woman stood in the doorway, mid-20s, her frame slight but defiant. She wore a weathered denim vest covered in patches, the kind that told stories of highways and hard choices. Intricate tattoos climbed her forearms like ivy on stone. Roses wrapped in thorns, birds breaking free from cages, words and scripts he couldn't read. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy braid, and her amber eyes darted across the room with the sharpness of someone being hunted. The few remaining customers shifted uneasily. Old Murray, the retired fisherman, lowered his mug with a quiet clink. Mrs. Pemberton, who came every Tuesday for the clam chowder, clutched her napkin like a lifeline. The young woman moved toward a booth near the back, sliding in with her shoulders hunched, making herself small, invisible. Gideon thought of Zelda, asleep in the apartment above, trusting him to keep their worlds standing. Then he grabbed a glass of water and a menu. "Welcome to the Anchor," he said, keeping his voice calm. "Special tonight is grilled swordfish, caught fresh this morning." She looked up at him then, and his chest tightened. Her eyes weren't the eyes of trouble. They were the eyes of someone running out of places to run. Before she could respond, the bell chimed again. Sharp and wrong this time. 2 officers filled the doorway. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The 2 officers who filled the doorway of the Anchor Diner weren't there for the swordfish special. Gideon recognized them immediately. Officer Vance led the way, his broad shoulders stretching the seams of his uniform, his boots striking the linoleum with the deliberate rhythm of a man who expected the world to move aside. Behind him came Deputy Shaw, younger, quieter, her eyes flicking around the room with something that looked almost like discomfort. Vance didn't bother with pleasantries. His gaze swept past the counter, past the nervous customers, and locked onto the young woman in the back booth like a predator finding wounded prey. "Well, well," Vance said, his voice carrying across the silent diner. "Looks like our little runaway found herself a hiding spot." The young woman's hands curled into fists beneath the table. Gideon watched her shrink back against the cracked vinyl seat, her earlier defiance crumbling into something rawer. Something that reminded him too much of Zelda during those first terrible months after her mother died. Mrs. Pemberton gathered her things with trembling hands, leaving a crumpled $5 bill on the table as she hurried toward the exit. Old Murray stayed frozen over his coffee, eyes fixed firmly on the countertop as if he could will himself invisible. The retired schoolteacher followed Mrs. Pemberton out, the bell chiming twice in quick succession. Two witnesses choosing the safety of silence. Gideon set down the menu he'd been holding and positioned himself near the end of the counter, placing his body between the officers and the path to the young woman's booth. "Evening, officers," he said, keeping his voice level. "Something I can help you with?" Vance barely glanced at him. "Stay out of this, Sterling. This doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in my diner concerns me." Vance's lip curled. He took another step forward, his hand resting casually on his belt, close enough to his holster to make the gesture unmistakable. "That girl back there is wanted for questioning. She's been causing problems up and down the coast, sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. We're just here to have a friendly conversation." Gideon looked past Vance to where Deputy Shaw stood near the door. Her expression was tight, conflicted, but she said nothing. He wondered how many times she'd stood in that exact position, watching, silent, complicit. "If she's wanted for something official, I'm sure you've got paperwork," Gideon said. "A warrant, maybe. Something with a judge's signature." Vance's eyes narrowed. The false friendliness drained from his face, replaced by something colder. "You really want to play this game with me? Over some tattooed vagrant?" From the back booth, the young woman spoke for the first time. Her voice was steadier than Gideon expected, though he could see her hands still trembling beneath the table. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said. "I have every right to be here." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Rights? That's cute." He started toward her booth, shouldering past Gideon with deliberate force. Gideon moved. He didn't think about the consequences, didn't calculate the cost. He simply stepped into Vance's path, placing himself squarely between the officer and the young woman, his hand flat on the counter beside him. "She's a guest in my establishment," Gideon said quietly. "As long as she's sitting in that booth, she's under my roof. And under my roof, people get treated with basic human decency." The diner fell absolutely silent. Even the overhead fan seemed to hold its breath. Vance stopped, his face reddening. He leaned in close enough that Gideon could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the angry vein pulsing at his temple. "You're making a very stupid decision, Sterling," Vance whispered, his voice low enough that only Gideon could hear. "I know all about your situation, the back taxes, the health inspector who's been meaning to pay you a visit, the liquor license that's up for renewal next month." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "I can bury this diner so deep, your grandchildren will still be digging it out." Gideon didn't flinch. He thought about Zelda, asleep upstairs, trusting him to keep their world from falling apart. He thought about his wife, the way she used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was choosing to do the right thing despite it. "Then I guess you'd better bring a shovel," Gideon said. For a long moment, the two men stood locked in silent combat. Deputy Shaw shifted uncomfortably by the door, her hand moving toward Vance's arm as if to pull him back. "Dean," she said quietly, "maybe we should." "Shut up, Laura." Vance didn't break eye contact with Gideon. "Fine. You want to protect this piece of trash? Be my guest. But remember this moment, Sterling. Remember it when everything you've built comes crashing down around you." He stepped back, adjusting his belt with exaggerated casualness. Then he turned and walked toward the door, boots striking the floor with sharp, angry percussion. Deputy Shaw hesitated a moment longer, her eyes meeting Gideon's with something that might have been regret or warning, before following her partner out into the night. The bell chimed once more, and then they were gone. Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands were shaking slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. He turned to look at the young woman in the back booth. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, gratitude, and something else. Something guarded. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Probably not." Gideon walked over to her booth, gesturing to the empty seat across from her. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. He slid into the booth, suddenly feeling every one of his 47 years in his bones. Up close, he could see the details he'd missed before. The dark circles under her eyes, the faint scar running along her jawline, the way her fingers kept moving restlessly across the tabletop as if ready to run at any moment. "I'm Gideon," he said. "Gideon Sterling." "Juno." She didn't offer a last name. "You want to tell me what that was really about, Juno?" She looked away, toward the dark windows where the Atlantic wind was picking up, rattling the old frames. "It's complicated." "I've got time." He gestured around the empty diner. "Not exactly drowning in customers at the moment." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, then disappeared. "Those officers, Vance especially, they don't like people asking questions about certain things that happen in this town. About money that goes missing from municipal funds. About permits that get approved for the right price. About—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You don't want to know. Trust me. The less you know, the safer you are." "Little late for that, don't you think?" Juno met his eyes, and for the first time, he saw the full weight of whatever burden she was carrying. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come in here. I saw the lights on, and I thought maybe I could sit somewhere warm for a few minutes. Figure out my next move." She started to slide out of the booth. "I should go. Before I cause you any more trouble. Sit down." She froze. Gideon's voice was gentle but firm. "Whatever's going on, running off into the night with those two circling like sharks isn't going to help. You need to eat something, rest for a bit, and figure out a real plan." He stood and walked back toward the counter. "Swordfish is off the menu. Sold the last piece this afternoon, but I can make you a mean grilled cheese. My daughter says it's the only thing I cook that doesn't taste like cardboard." Despite everything, Juno laughed. It was a small sound, fragile but real. She slid back into the booth. "Your daughter sounds smart. Too smart for her own good." Gideon disappeared into the kitchen, calling back over his shoulder. "Just like her mother was." Upstairs, Zelda Sterling slept with her chemistry textbook open on her chest, unaware of the drama unfolding one floor below. At 17, she had her mother's eyes, deep brown, flecked with gold, and her father's stubbornness. The small apartment above the diner was cramped but clean, its walls covered with photographs from happier times and Zelda's collection of academic achievement certificates. Gideon climbed the stairs just after midnight. Having finally convinced Juno to sleep in the storage room he'd converted into a makeshift guest space during hurricane season. His legs ached, his head throbbed. But when he cracked open Zelda's door and saw her peaceful face illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window, something in his chest loosened. This was why he did everything. Why he woke at 4 every morning to prep the kitchen. Why he smiled at customers who left lousy tips and fought with suppliers who raised prices. Why he'd stood between a stranger and 2 armed officers without a second thought. Zelda was his reason, his anchor. He pulled the textbook gently from beneath her hands and set it on the nightstand, then tugged her blanket up to her chin. She stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible, before settling back into sleep. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Gideon knew that as surely as he knew the tide tables. Vance wasn't the type to let a public humiliation slide. There would be inspections, citations, whispered campaigns to drive customers away. The already thin margins of the anchor would grow thinner still. But tonight his daughter was safe. The young woman downstairs had a warm place to sleep. And Gideon Sterling had done the right thing, the only thing he could do. He closed Zelda's door softly and walked to his own small bedroom at the end of the hall. Sleep came slowly, troubled by dreams of rising waters and doors that wouldn't open. The morning broke gray and cold, the storm that had been threatening finally making good on its promise. Rain lashed the windows of the Anchor as Gideon went through his opening routine, brewing coffee, prepping the grill, unlocking the front door with the same key his father had given him 23 years ago. Juno was already awake when he came downstairs, her denim vest folded neatly on the storage room cot, her face freshly washed. She looked different in the pale morning light. Younger, more vulnerable, but also more determined. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything." "Breakfast first," Gideon replied. "Then we can talk about next steps." But breakfast was interrupted by the first sign of trouble. At 7:30, when the early crowd would normally start trickling in, the fishermen grabbing coffee before heading to the docks, the teachers fueling up before school, the Anchor remained empty. Gideon watched the minutes tick by on the old clock above the register, a cold knot forming in his stomach. By 8 o'clock, not a single customer had walked through the door. At 8:15, Zelda came downstairs, her backpack slung over one shoulder, and stopped short when she saw the empty dining room. "Dad? Where is everyone?" "Running late, I guess." He tried to keep his voice light, but Zelda knew him too well. Her eyes narrowed. "What happened last night? I heard voices. Loud ones." "Nothing for you to worry about. Just some difficult customers." Zelda looked at Juno, then back at her father, clearly unconvinced. But the bus honked outside, and she had no time to press further. She grabbed a muffin from the display case and kissed Gideon on the cheek. "We're talking about this later," she warned, then dashed out into the rain. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. At 9 o'clock, Gideon finally admitted to himself what was happening. He walked to the front window and looked out at Main Street, watching the few pedestrians hurrying past with their umbrellas, pointedly avoiding eye contact with the Anchor, crossing to the other side of the street as they passed. Word had spread. Vance had made sure of that. "They're boycotting you," Juno said quietly from behind him. "Because of me." Gideon didn't turn around. "People make their own choices. This is on them, not you." "But listen to me." He finally faced her, and his expression was fierce. "I've lived in this town my whole life. I've seen it at its best and its worst. Right now, it's showing its worst, and that's a reflection on them. Not on you and not on me." He shook his head. "Besides, a few slow days won't kill us." But they both knew it was more than that. The phone rang twice that morning, both cancellations from parties that had booked the back room for private events. Old Murray called to apologize, his voice tight and uncomfortable, explaining that his wife didn't think it was appropriate for him to keep patronizing the Anchor given the circumstances. He hung up before Gideon could respond. By noon, the lunch rush proved to be just as barren as the morning. Gideon sat behind the counter, staring at the plate of food he'd prepped out of habit, enough for a crowd that wasn't coming. That's when he noticed the envelope. It had been slipped under the door sometime during the morning, so quietly he hadn't heard it. Plain white, no return address, his name scrawled across the front in block letters. He opened it with steady hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed in cold, clinical font. "Traitors don't last long in Mystic. Drop the girl or lose everything." There was no signature, no identifying marks. But Gideon didn't need a signature to know where it had come from. Juno appeared at his shoulder, reading the note. Her face went pale. "I have to leave," she said. "Now. Before they—" "No. Gideon, you don't understand. These people, they're not just local cops playing power games. There's something bigger happening here. Something I've spent months trying to expose. If you get caught in the middle—" "I'm already in the middle." He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. And I'm not the type to run from bullies. Never have been. Juno stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then she reached into her vest pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. Everything I've found is on here, she said quietly. Corruption, embezzlement, evidence that certain local officials have been lining their pockets for years. I was supposed to meet with someone today, someone who could help me get this information to the right people. But Vance and his crew have been watching me for weeks. They must have known I was close. Gideon looked at the flash drive, then back at her. Who were you supposed to meet? Before Juno could answer, the sound of engines filled the air. They both turned toward the window. At first, Gideon thought it was the police, Vance returning with reinforcements to make good on his threats. His hand instinctively moved toward the phone, ready to call the only lawyer he could afford, already calculating how many years of savings would disappear in legal fees. But the vehicles turning onto Main Street weren't police cruisers. They were black SUVs. One after another, they rolled into Mystic like a slow-moving storm, their windows tinted dark, their formation precise. Gideon counted as they passed, 5, 10, 15, 20, each one identical to the last, each one moving with purpose toward the Anchor Diner. The town watched in stunned silence. Shop owners stepped out onto the sidewalk, umbrellas forgotten, rain soaking their clothes as they stared at the convoy. Mrs. Pemberton clutched her chest from the doorway of the pharmacy. Even the seagulls seemed to pause their eternal circling. The lead SUV pulled to a stop directly in front of the diner. Then the second. Then the third. Within minutes, 20 black vehicles filled the street, their engines idling in unison. Gideon's mouth went dry. Juno, standing beside him, let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. They found me, she whispered. Who? Gideon demanded. Who are these people? The door of the lead SUV opened. A man stepped out, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the Anchor's monthly revenue. His face was weathered but composed, his eyes sharp beneath steel-gray brows. And those eyes went immediately to the window where Juno stood. My father, she said quietly. Director Callahan, head of the Federal Task Force on Municipal Corruption. Gideon stared at her. Your father is a federal director? I told you, she said, a sad smile crossing her face. It's complicated. The bell above the door chimed as Director Callahan entered the Anchor Diner, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits. His gaze swept the room. The empty booths, the cold grill, the lone flash drive clutched in his daughter's hand, and something dangerous flickered across his expression. Then he looked at Gideon. Mr. Sterling, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came with decades of service. I understand you protected my daughter last night when no one else would. Gideon straightened. I did what anyone should have done. No. Director Callahan shook his head slowly. You did what almost no one does. You stood up when standing up cost you something. He glanced out the window at the empty street, the abandoned sidewalks, the town that had turned its back on a good man. I'm here to make sure that cost doesn't stand. Outside, the convoy waited. The rain continued to fall. And in the doorway of the Anchor Diner, a single father who had risked everything for a stranger began to understand that the world sometimes rewarded courage in ways no one could predict. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Director Callahan stood in the center of the Anchor Diner, his presence filling the small space with an authority that made the worn booths and faded photographs seem suddenly insignificant. Behind him, agents moved with quiet efficiency, speaking into earpieces, scanning the street through rain-streaked windows. Juno crossed the room and embraced her father. It was a brief gesture, restrained by years of professional distance, but Gideon caught the way Callahan's hand lingered on his daughter's shoulder, the touch of a man who had spent too many sleepless nights wondering if she was safe. "You should have called me sooner," Callahan said quietly. "I needed to finish the investigation," Juno replied. "I needed proof that couldn't be disputed." She held up the flash drive, and something passed between father and daughter, an understanding built on years of shared purpose. Callahan took it gently, turning it over in his fingers like it was made of glass. 3 years of corruption," he murmured. "Municipal funds siphoned into private accounts. Permits sold to the highest bidder. Local law enforcement used as personal enforcers." He looked at Gideon. "My daughter has been working undercover for 18 months, Mr. Sterling, following the money trail that led straight to this town." When Officer Vance realized how close she was getting, he tried to silence her the only way men like him know how, through intimidation and force. Gideon thought about the threatening note still folded in his pocket, about the empty diner and the neighbors who wouldn't meet his eyes, about the price he'd been willing to pay for doing nothing more than showing kindness to a stranger. "Your daughter didn't tell me any of this," he said. "She was protecting you." Callahan's expression softened slightly. "The less you knew, the less they could use against you. But you protected her anyway, without knowing who she was or what she represented. That kind of integrity," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "That kind of integrity is rare, Mr. Sterling. Rarer than you know." The bell above the door chimed again, and 2 more figures entered, a woman in her 50s with Juno's same amber eyes, and a younger man who shared Callahan's sharp features. Juno's mother and brother, Gideon realized, watching as they pulled her into fierce embraces. "We came as soon as we heard," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. "When your father told us what happened, what this man did for you." She turned to Gideon, and before he could react, she had crossed the room and taken both his hands in hers. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for seeing my daughter as a person worth protecting when everyone else saw only a target." Gideon didn't know what to say. He thought of Zelda, of how he would feel if someone had sheltered her when the world turned cruel. The words caught in his throat. Outside, the convoy remained in formation, drawing stares from every corner of Mystic. Gideon watched through the window as shop owners emerged from their stores, as the morning crowd gathered on sidewalks, as the town that had shunned him hours ago now buzzed with confusion and curiosity. Then a police cruiser appeared at the end of Main Street. Officer Vance stepped out, his face twisted with barely contained rage. Deputy Shaw followed more slowly, her expression unreadable. They approached the diner with the swagger of men who believed their badges made them untouchable. Vance pushed through the door without knocking, his hand already pointing at Juno. "I don't know who you people think you are, but that woman is wanted for questioning in an ongoing." He stopped mid-sentence. Director Callahan had turned to face him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. 2 federal agents flanked the director, their hands resting casually, but unmistakably, near their sidearms. "Officer Vance," Callahan said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had faced down far more dangerous adversaries. "I was hoping you'd show up." Vance's face went pale. His eyes darted to the agents, to the convoy visible through the windows, to the federal insignias that suddenly seemed to be everywhere. I wasn't." "You weren't what?" Callahan stepped forward, and Vance actually retreated. "You weren't threatening my daughter last night? You weren't attempting an unlawful arrest without probable cause? You weren't intimidating a local business owner for having the audacity to demand basic due process. Deputy Shaw had gone rigid by the door, her hand frozen halfway to her radio. She looked at Vance, then at the federal agents, and something shifted in her expression. A decision being made in real time. "Director," she said quietly, stepping away from her partner, "I have information about the corruption in this department, about what Officer Vance has been doing for the past 3 years." Vance spun toward her. "Laura, don't you dare. I'm done." Shaw's voice was steady now, resolved. "I'm done looking the other way. I'm done pretending I don't see what's happening." She met Gideon's eyes. "Mr. Sterling did what I should have done a long time ago. He stood up. And I'm choosing to stand up now." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Federal agents escorted Vance to a waiting vehicle, his protests growing weaker as the reality of his situation sank in. Deputy Shaw gave a preliminary statement to Callahan's team, her testimony adding another nail to the coffin of Mystic's corrupt administration. Phone calls were made to Washington, to the state attorney general, to agencies whose names Gideon had only ever heard on the evening news. Through it all, the Anchor Diner served as the unlikely command center for the largest federal operation the town had ever seen. Zelda burst through the door just before noon, still in her school clothes, having heard the rumors spreading through Mystic like wildfire. She stopped short at the sight of the agents, the equipment, the silver-haired director speaking quietly with her father in the corner booth. "Dad." Her voice was small, uncertain. "What's happening?" Gideon pulled her into a hug, holding her tighter than he had in years. "Something good, sweetheart. For once, something good." 3 weeks later, Gideon stood on a ladder in the Anchor Diner, a brass plaque clutched in his weathered hands. The morning light streamed through windows that had been replaced just days ago, a gift from the Federal Renovation Fund that Director Callahan had quietly arranged. The new grill gleamed in the kitchen. The old cash register had been replaced with a modern system that actually worked. And for the first time in years, every booth was occupied. The plaque was simple, its inscription brief: "The Anchor Diner, where everyone deserves protection." Zelda handed him the screwdriver from below, watching as he secured the plaque to the wall beside the entrance. When he climbed down, she slipped her arm through his. "Mom would be proud," she said quietly. Gideon looked around his diner, at the fishermen who had returned, sheepish but genuine in their apologies, at Mrs. Pemberton, who now made a point of coming in every single morning, at the new faces drawn by the story that had spread far beyond Mystic's borders. Juno had left 2 weeks ago, called back to Washington to testify before a congressional committee. But she'd promised to return for the grand reopening, and true to her word, she sat in the back booth with her family, a cup of Gideon's coffee warming her hands. The contract for federal catering events sat in Gideon's office, already signed. Zelda's college fund had been quietly supplemented by a community resilience grant that Callahan had somehow procured. The back taxes had been paid, the liquor license renewed. The future that had seemed so precarious now stretched out before them, solid and bright. Old Murray approached the counter, hat in hand, the same man who had called 3 weeks ago to cancel his patronage. "Gideon," he said, his voice rough with shame, "I owe you an apology. We all do. What you did. Standing up like that when the rest of us were too scared." He shook his head. "This town forgot what it meant to be neighbors. You reminded us." Gideon poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. "Everyone makes mistakes, Murray. What matters is what we do after." Through the window, Mystic was coming back to life. The shops that had closed their doors were reopening. The sidewalks that had been empty now bustled with residents who had remembered how to look each other in the eye. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new was growing. Gideon turned to face his diner, his legacy, his anchor, his home. And for the first time in 3 years, he smiled without any weight behind it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.